Darkness had settled over Fort Campbell's back 93,000 acres of thick forest, swamps, and open fields that swallowed soldiers whole in its silence. For most new recruits, the back 40 was simply training ground, a place to test endurance, discipline, and survival skills. But for the veterans, it carried a far more sinister reputation. On a summer night in July, the air was heavy with heat and the buzzing of insects. A platoon of infantry soldiers had been sent into the woods as part of a 12-day field exercise. Their mission was straightforward: secure a makeshift town known as Cassidy and establish blocking positions in the surrounding tree line. It should have been routine. It should have been predictable. But as midnight approached, routine faded into dread. One squad leader leaned back against the rough bark of an oak tree, eyes scanning the tree line. He was exhausted but alert enough to notice the odd silence. The frogs had stopped croaking. The owls had gone quiet, and even the cicadas had stilled their restless buzzing. That silence, unnatural in the Kentucky woods, pressed against his eardrums until he could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heart. He told himself it was just fatigue, the 12th day of relentless exercises gnawing at his senses. But then came the sound of deliberate, heavy steps on damp leaves, approaching slow to slow, as if something was stalking. At first, he thought it was the RTO, the radio man who had been pacing back and forth all night delivering batteries and checking comms. But the silhouette in the darkness didn't move like a man. Squinting into the black void, he caught the faint outline of something crouched low, its body elongated, its movements animalistic. He froze. The figure lowered itself further, emitting a guttural growl so subtle, so primal, that the soldier's breath caught in his throat. The sound didn't echo like a coyote or a wolf. It vibrated, low and controlled, like the warning rumble of a predator preparing to strike. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The soldier's training screamed at him to raise his weapon, but instinct told him not to move. For a moment, time slowed, the darkness closing in, the smell of wet earth mixing with something far fouler, musk, damp fur, and rot. When he finally dared to flip down his night vision goggles, the creature bolted, not like a man, not like a deer, but on two legs, low to the ground, running with terrifying speed. The crashing of branches echoed through the back 40 as the squad jolted awake, rifles raised, eyes wide with confusion and terror. But by then, the forest had already swallowed it whole. That was the first sighting that night. It would not be the last. And before dawn, the platoon would realize the legends of Fort Campbell were more than just campfire stories. Something else roamed these woods, something older, hungrier, and far more intelligent than they could ever imagine. Fort Campbell has always been more than just a military installation. Straddling the Kentucky-Tennessee border, it houses some of the most elite units in the U.S. Army: the 101st Airborne Division, the Green Berets of the 5th Special Forces Group, and the infamous 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers, to outsiders, it is simply a training hub for warfighters. But to those stationed there long enough, Fort Campbell is a place where reality and nightmare blur. The area known as the Back 40 is infamous amongst soldiers. Spread across 93,000 acres of forests, lakes, and abandoned farmhouses, it is a place where soldiers train for war, but also where unexplainable things occur. Every generation of recruits inherits the same whispered warnings. Don't wander alone after dark. Don't ignore the silence. And if you hear growling in the distance, pray it isn't close. Reports of strange activity around Fort Campbell stretch back decades. In the 1940s, Air Force Captain Thomas Mantle died in a plane crash after pursuing a mysterious object in the Kentucky sky, a tragedy that remains unexplained. In the 1950s, the Kelly Hopkinsville incident occurred just miles from the base. Families claimed to be terrorized by small goblin-like creatures. By the 1980s, local police and army personnel had reported diamond-shaped rafts that shut down radio towers, lights that hovered silently over training fields, and shadowy figures glimpsed at the edges of night patrols. But perhaps most chilling were the accounts from soldiers themselves. Barracks haunted by disembodied footsteps. Pierce Village housing where families swore they were visited by ghostly figures. Helicopter pilots spotting humanoid shapes moving unnaturally fast across training grounds. One NCO recalled hearing guttural howls that silenced entire packs of quits, the sound vibrating through his chest, like the roar of something colossal and unseen. To the army, these were just stories, the exaggerated imaginations of soldiers under stress. But within the ranks, Soldiers passed them down like folklore. They called them smoke-hut stories, tales shared during long nights of guard duty or between missions, when fear and exhaustion stripped away skepticism. Still, among the many ghost tales and UFO sightings, one legend stood apart. Whispers of a predator in the woods, described as towering, wolf-like, and intelligent. Soldiers spoke of glowing eyes, the stench of wet fur, and the sensation of being stalked just beyond the tree line. They called it the Dogman. It was a name that carried weight. Some laughed it off. Others swore they had seen it. And though no official record acknowledged such a creature, enough encounters existed to make even the bravest rangers uneasy about the back 40 after nightfall. What the squad leader and his men encountered that July night was not the first report of the Dogman, but it was one of the most terrifyingly detailed, and it would mark the beginning of a series of events that none of them would ever forget. The soldier had spent enough nights in the field to know the rhythm of the woods. The back 40, as wild as it was, usually hummed with life. Quails yipped in the distance, frogs croaked from the swampy lowlands, and insects filled the gaps between. But on that night, silence cut through the forest like a blade. It wasn't the calm of peace, it was the quiet of something lurking, a predator moving just out of sight. He shifted against the trunk of the oak tree, checking on his men spread out along the line. Most were exhausted, half asleep, fighting the urge to drift off. The platoon radio man passed behind him every 20 minutes or so, boots crunching softly on the forest floor. By now, the sound was familiar, routine, which is why, at first, he thought nothing of the footsteps approaching again. But this time, the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too heavy, as if each step was deliberate, testing the ground. "Otio," the soldier whispered into the darkness. No answer. The figure emerged, crouched low, 20 meters out. His night vision goggles weren't down yet, but even in the faint light of the town behind them, he could make out its shape. Broad shoulders hunched forward, arms longer than they should have been, the silhouette of a head, snout extended, nostrils flaring dot. It growled not loud, but deep, vibrating through the ground and into his chest. It was the kind of sound an apex predator makes, a warning more than a threat. The soldier's instinct screamed at him to stay still. He gripped the handle of his entrenching tool, the small folding shovel strapped to his belt, because it was the only thing within reach. His rifle was just a foot away, but somehow, in that moment, he was afraid to break eye contact. The seconds stretched into eternity. He could see it lowering itself further, muscles coiled, as though preparing to spring. His breath caught, chest tight, sweat rolling down his temple despite the humid summer air already clinging to his skin. He tried to steady himself, reminding his mind that fear had no place here. Yet, every instinct primal, ancient told him this was no ordinary threat. Finally, with a trembling hand, he flipped his night vision goggles down. The moment the green glow washed over his sight, the creature bolted. It launched forward into the woods at a speed he couldn't comprehend. Not for legs, too. Its body was hunched low, but it was upright, the outline unmistakable. Branches snapped, leaves thrashed, and the entire squad jerked awake at the sound of it tearing through the forest. The soldier quickly switched to thermal. For a split second, he saw it, a blazing outline of heat, massive, charging diagonally. Away, too fast for a man, too upright for a deer. Then it was gone. The forest swallowed it, leaving only silence in its wake. But the silence was different this time, heavier, colder. His men whispered nervously, some clutching rifles, others scanning the tree line, and that was when he smelled it, wet fur, musk, and something rotten, almost like decay. It clung to the air around them, thick and undeniable. The soldier didn't say a word, but in that moment, he knew with certainty, whatever he had seen was real. And worse, it wasn't alone. The rain had started just as the second squad finished digging in. Thick Kentucky summer storms rolled over Fort Campbell, without warning, turning hard-packed dirt into sucking mud and filling foxholes like bathtubs. Soldiers cursed under their breath as they bailed water with helmets and empty ammo cans. Wet ponchos clung to their bodies, offering little comfort from the downpour. Morale was low. After nearly 2 weeks in the field, food was down to MRE scraps. Cigarettes were soggy, and everyone was running on fumes. They were supposed to be training to hold a defensive line, but it felt more like punishment. One soldier leaned back against a tree, water dripping from his helmet, muttering, "If this doesn't earn me free college, nothing will." His buddy chuckled, adding, "Yeah, don't forget about the Dodge Charger you'll buy with your Signing bonus. The platoon's RTO appeared, swapping out dead radio batteries. He cracked a joke, tried to lighten the mood, then disappeared into the sheets of rain. That was when the sound came at first. It was faint, almost lost in the patter of rainfall. But soon, all of them heard its slow, deliberate movement through the brush. The kind of noise you don't ignore in the middle of nowhere. Probably the RTO again, the squad leader muttered, though his voice carried no conviction. But when the figure appeared at the edge of their vision, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning, every man froze. It wasn't the RTO. It wasn't human at all. The thing stood upright, tall as a man. But its outline was wrong to broad, to hunched. Its head jutted forward, ears high, like a wolf standing on two legs. Rain glistened off its fur, and even from that distance, its eyes reflected the lightning with an unnatural gleam. Jesus. You see that? Whispered the gunner, hands trembling. On his weapon, the creature crouched low, sniffing the air. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural exhale, half growl, half breath. The smell followed, riding the wind even through the storm. Wet dog, musk, and something acrid, like burnt hair. The squad leader raised a hand, signaling silence. No one dared move. Then the coyotes started. Their yips and howls echoed across the back 40, sharp and wild, as if announcing the presence of something far greater. But just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. Every single one. The forest went silent again. Not quite dead, and in that silence, the creature let out a howl. It wasn't like a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, louder, vibrating through their bones. A sound so powerful that even the rain seemed muted for a moment. The men gripped their rifles tighter. One soldier whispered, "That ain't no animal I've ever seen." Lightning flashed again, and the figure was gone. The underbrush shook violently, branches snapping as it moved with impossible speed, vanishing into the night. No one slept after that. They sat in the mud, rifles trained on the tree line, waiting for something else to appear. And though the storm eventually passed, the feeling lingered, the sense that something ancient, something predatory, was stalking them in those woods. By the time dawn should have been creeping over the back 40, the forest was still draped in a heavy, suffocating darkness. Clouds smothered the sky, denying the men even a sliver of moonlight. No one had slept. They sat in silence, rifles clutched to their chests, staring at the dripping tree line as if it might lunge forward at any second. She wasn't just one squad anymore. Word had spread down the line. Different fire teams whispered the same thing. Something was out there. Some swore they saw glowing eyes between the trees. Others claimed they heard low growls circling their positions. A few said they smelled wet fur, rank and pungent, wafting in from the shadows. At first, the squad leaders tried to keep discipline. Eyes forward. Stay sharp, they ordered. But as minutes bled into hours, even the NCOs found themselves glancing nervously over their shoulders. Then it came, a sound unlike anything the men had ever heard before. It started low, a rumble that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Then it grew, climbing in pitch until it rolled into a full, guttural howl that rattled their teeth and made their stomachs clench. It was so loud, so raw, that it cut straight through the rain and thunder, drowning out every natural noise of the forest. The men froze, every single one. Some clamped their hands tighter around their rifles. Others found themselves instinctively crouching lower into the mud, as though pressing themselves into the earth might make them invisible. A few simply sat, paralyzed, eyes wide and unblinking. Coyotes had been calling earlier that night, their high-pitched yips echoing across the training grounds. But the instant this howl cut through the forest, they had gone silent. It was as if the smaller predators of the land recognized something greater had claimed the night. What the hell was that? One soldier hissed, his voice cracking. Another whispered, "That wasn't a coyote. Wasn't a wolf either." The RTO tried to key his radio, maybe to report what was happening, maybe just for the comfort of human voices on the other end. But all he got was static, the kind that screeched and popped as though the air itself were charged. He clicked it off, shaking his head, saying nothing. Then the smell came again, stronger this time. Damp fur, musk, and something sharp, like rotting meat. A few men gagged, pulling their collars up to their noses. Suddenly, from the far left of the line, a private shouted, "Movement!" Muzzle flashes split the night, 3 short bursts of automatic fire. The sound ricocheted across the forest, deafening in the damp air. Branches shook in the distance, followed by crashing noises. Something heavy plowing through the brush at impossible speed. The platoon braced for contact. Fingers tightened on triggers, hearts pounded in their chests, but nothing came. The forest went silent again. Not just quiet and naturally void of life. No crickets, no frogs, no wind. The howl had warned them. The gunfire had answered, and now the woods were waiting. By the next night, exhaustion was eating the men alive. They hadn't slept more than scattered minutes since the first encounter, and the unrelenting tension had worn their nerves raw. Every shadow in the trees looked alive. Every snapping twig made rifles jerk up in trembling hands. The army taught discipline. Years of training drilled into every soldier the idea that fear must be suppressed, controlled, mastered. But in the back 40 that night, fear wasn't something you could control. It was in the air itself, thick and heavy, settling over them like a damp blanket they couldn't shake off. Small cracks began to show. A private from Alpha Team refused to pull his watch shift, insisting he'd seen the creature circling them the hour before. His squad leader dragged him back into position, hissing threats of disciplinary action. But the young man's eyes were wide and glassy, darting toward the woods every second. He kept mumbling, "It's out there. It's still out there." Another soldier, normally steady, started obsessively clicking the safety on his rifle. On, off, on, off. The sharp metallic sound grated on everyone's nerves until finally the sergeant snapped at him to stop. The man froze, apologized, and then a moment later started doing it again. Like he couldn't help himself. Then came the laughter. Somewhere down the line, a voice began chuckling. Low at first, then louder, until it carried over the squad positions. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was thin, broken, the sound of a man's mind fraying. When his team leader rushed over to shut him up, they found him staring into the dark tree line, giggling to himself, whispering, "It wants us tired. It wants us weak." The leadership did their best to hold the line. Orders were barked. Rotations were forced. But the men were unraveling. The forest seemed endless, a prison made of trees and shadows, and every second spent in it twisted the pressure tighter. That night, the sound returned, not a howl this time, but movement. Heavy, deliberate steps circling the perimeter, leaves crunching, branches snapping. Too large to be deer, too heavy to be coyote. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose, testing them, never fully revealing itself. "Hold your fire," the lieutenant whispered into the radio net. His voice was calm, but strained, every word stretched thin. "No firing unless you have positive ID." "That's an order." The steps grew closer and closer. Somewhere on the right flank, a soldier broke. He screamed, a raw sound, and opened fire into the dark. The rapid crack of his M4 shattered the night, bullets chewing through trees. Others immediately followed, panic spreading like wildfire. Spraying bursts into the shadows without target, without discipline. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The NCOS roared, tackling their men, grabbing rifles, trying to wrestle back control. The gunfire sputtered out, leaving ringing ears and the smell of burnt powder, and then silence again. Except for one thing, from deep in the tree line came a sound no one expected, a snarl. Deep, guttural, and close enough that every man knew. Their wild gunfire hadn't scared it away. T had only made it bolder. The forest had gone still again. Too still. Every soldier froze, their nerves stretched tight as wire. Breath came in short bursts. Sweat rolled down faces despite the night's cool air. The sound of the snarl still echoed in their skulls, a growl so primal it cut through body. Armor and training alike, the lieutenant hissed over comms, eyes up. "Weapons ready. Nobody fires unless you see it." But deep down, they all knew that wasn't going to hold. And then branches parted. A figure stepped out from the tree line, and for the first time, the soldiers saw what had been hunting them. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a wolf. It was something caught horribly between. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, it moved with the crooked grace of a predator that didn't belong to this world. Muscles rippled beneath shaggy, dark fur, glistening faintly in the moonlight that had finally broken through the clouds. Its shoulders were too broad, its arms too long, its hands tipped with claws that curled into the dirt. And then there was the face, a muzzle elongated like a wolf's, but with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural intelligence. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were focused, calculating. Every man there would later swear the same thing. The Dogman wasn't just looking at them. It was studying them. No one moved. No one breathed. Then in a single, impossible motion, it dropped low to all fours, sprinting with terrifying speed across the clearing. The blur of movement was so fast, so powerful, that trained infantrymen, the very soldiers whose job was to face chaos head-on, hesitated to even aim. The creature skidded to a stop just beyond the farthest foxhole, standing upright again in a single, fluid motion. A private screamed, unleashing a burst of rifle fire. The rounds tore into the underbrush, but the Dogman was already gone. It reappeared on the left flank, a shadow flashing between trees, close enough that one soldier swore he felt the air shift as it passed. Another burst of fire ripped through the woods. Again, nothing but splintered bark and dirt, and then silence. The forest swallowed it whole, but the soldiers knew better. The smell hit them first: wet fur, musk, and something foul, like decay. It lingered heavy in the air, a reminder that the thing hadn't retreated far. It was circling again, hunting with a predator's patience, the lieutenant whispered into the radio, his voice almost breaking. It's playing with us. Nobody argued. Nobody dared, because they all felt the truth of it. The Dogman could have torn through them at any moment, but it hadn't. Not yet. Instead, it wanted something else first. It wanted them to break. By the time dawn broke over Fort Campbell's back 40, the platoon looked less like a group of hardened infantrymen, and more like survivors of a nightmare. Eyes bloodshot, hands shaking, nerves shredded. These weren't men who had simply pulled an all-night watch. They were men who had looked into something they could never explain. The lieutenant finally gave the order to collapse the perimeter. Nobody argued. As the soldiers packed up, every sound in the woods, a snapping twig, a rustling leaf, made them flinch. Some swore they could still hear it pacing in the tree line, watching, but nothing came. By the time they reached the mock village of Cassidy, the creature had vanished. The woods stood silent, almost mocking. To any outsider, it was just another training exercise. But to the men who had been out there, it was something else entirely. Weeks later, when they sat in the barracks or around the smoke pit, the stories began to surface. One private admitted he'd wet himself when he saw the thing's glowing eyes. Another confessed he still heard that guttural growl whenever he closed his eyes at night. And then there were the dreams, dark, vivid dreams of running through the woods while something chased them just out of sight. Not everyone believed. The higher-ups dismissed it as stress, fatigue, or imagination. Soldiers see strange things when they're tired, was the official line. Reports were buried. Files went missing. The men were told to forget it. But you don't just forget. Years later, veterans of that night still refused to camp in the back 40. Some left the army early, unable to shake the feeling that something had marked them. A few even claimed that, long after leaving Kentucky, they would still catch glimpses of glowing eyes in the corner of their vision, or hear the faint sound of claws scraping against concrete when no one else was around. The strangest part, their stories weren't unique. When word spread quietly among other units, soldiers from different eras admitted they'd had their own encounters: unsettling noises, giant shadows, the smell of wet fur carried on the wind. Fort Campbell, it seemed, had always belonged to something more than just the US Army, and so the legend of the Dogman lives on. To this day, there are soldiers who will warn you if you find yourself in the back 40 and the forest goes quiet. If you smell wet fur, if you hear coyotes howl and then fall silent, don't move. Don't breathe, because something is out there and it's watching.